Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila again. Yes, I still sound funny, but at least I get to be here to tell you another story. You may have to listen very carefully. Well, our story today is called Number 2. Well, our story happened a long time ago, but it all started with Bobby and Grandma. Now, Bobby, he lived with his elderly grandma. And this morning, something terrible had happened. Grandma had been walking carefully, oh, so carefully, down the stairs, like she always did, when her foot caught. And Grandma went tumbling, bump, 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 all the way down those stairs, clear to the bottom. And there she lay. Now, Bobby was the only one that lived with Grandma. And he rushed over. Oh, Grandma, he said, I'll go get the neighbor. So Bobby rushed out the front door and down the front steps and off to the neighbor's house. And he pounded on the door. And the neighbor lady, she came to the door and she said, Bobby, what are you doing here? And Bobby's eyes were all big, and he was panting from running, and he said, Oh, Mrs. Moore, Grandma fell down the stairs. Oh, I think she's hurt. So Mrs. Moore, of course, ran quickly over to see about Grandma, and she got on the phone, and she called the ambulance. Well, they took Grandma to the hospital, and when they looked at the x-rays, Grandma's leg was broken. It ended up that the ambulance brought Grandma back home, and on her leg, she had a big white cast, and she couldn't move her leg in it. Well, that's what casts are for, you know. That's to keep the broken bones from moving around. Well, that cast, when they put a cast on, it's soft. But when it dries, it's hard, just like cement. Well, Grandma, the only thing Grandma could do right now was lay in bed with her leg up like this on a whole stack of pillows. Well, a few days later, the neighbor lady had come over to visit. And she had put a little tiny table in Grandma's bedroom by her bed. And she said, now Bobby can eat with you. So Bobby had his own little chair there at the table, and they were eating supper. Well, the neighbor lady, she had sat down in a chair as well, and she was visiting with Grandma. And Grandma was really disappointed, and she was depressed. She said, it's Wednesday. I can't go to prayer meeting. I'm number 2, you know. It's generally just the pastor and I. And of course God comes. But there won't be a number 2 tonight. Nobody else goes. But Bobby was listening. And Grandma had said, you know how in the Bible it says, where 2 are gathered together, I will be there. Well, I've always been number two, and I know God will be there then. And Bobby had finished eating, but he was just sitting there politely, listening to Grandma talk to the neighbor. Well, he quietly got up, and he took his plate and his glass and his silverware, and he went out the door. Well, Grandma didn't think anything about it, and neither did the neighbor lady. Bobby was just being a good boy, taking his dishes downstairs, and probably going to go to the bathroom or something. Well, Bobby, he had a plan in mind. In his mind, he was thinking, I can be number two for Grandma. I can go and speak to God. So he went to the mudroom, and there on the wall there were hooks. And there was a hook that was low enough for Bobby's little coat. He had a little trench coat. And he took it off the hook, and he had a hard time getting his arms in it. Grandma gently held it up for him to put it on, but Grandma was upstairs. So he got his coat on, and he opened the door ever so quietly. And he looked outside, and oh my, it was dark out there. Now, he had never been outside in the dark. What could he do? But then he looked around and he thought, I'm going to church. Jesus will be with me. So he started walking down that street that would lead him to the church. He didn't seem to mind the dark anymore when he thought about Jesus being there with him. And then he heard somebody behind him, and he turned around and he looked. And there was Mr. Peter Queerly. Well, he didn't have the best habits in the world. Matter of fact, he was kind of wobbling down the sidewalk. But he looked at Bobby and he said, Where are you going, young man? And Bobby said, I'm going to church, to prayer meeting. I'm going to be number two. So God will come and meet with us and talk to us. And so he turned and he went on down the street again. Well, Peter Curley, he stood there and he thought for a little bit, and he followed on behind Bobby. Well, when Bobby got to the church, he climbed the steps and he pushed the front door open, and he stood in the foyer looking down the aisle into the church. And sure enough, there he saw the pastor all by himself. It's a good thing I came, he thought. There wouldn't be a number two if I hadn't come. So he went down the aisle and he stood by the pastor. Well, the pastor, Bobby was so little he didn't notice him right away. He turned around and he saw Bobby there, and he smiled at him and he patted him on the head and he said, What are you doing here, little man? Do you know what Bobby said? He said, Oh, Pastor, I'm number two. I've come to pray with you. Has God come yet? The pastor, he looked at him and he squatted down in front of Bobby and he said, Did you come to pray with me? And Bobby's head went up and down and up and down. The pastor said, That's wonderful. Then we'll pray together. And Bobby said, Yes, I'll say my prayers and you can say your prayers. You pray first. They knelt down on the floor and they folded their hands and they bowed their heads and shut their eyes. And the pastor, he prayed a beautiful prayer to God, asking for every one of the people in his church and all the people that lived in the village that they would get to know Jesus better. And maybe they would start coming to pray to God. Well, when he was done, Bobby started praying. Now, because Bobby was so little, he didn't necessarily pray like you and I would pray. He had a little prayer book at home with pretty pictures in it, with words that he had learned. And he prayed all those pretty little prayers that he had memorized. The pastor smiled to himself and he thought how pleased God would be. Well, before they even finished praying, there was a noise. And here came Peter Crowley down the aisle, swaying down the aisle. And he got to the end of that aisle where they were kneeling, and he plopped down on the floor on his knees, and he said, I've come to pray to God, if it's all right, that he'll change my life and make me a better person. And Mr. Peter Crowley began to pray. The tears ran down his face. And when he got done praying, he smiled broadly at the pastor. And he said, Pastor, I'll be here every Wednesday night to talk to God. I want to speak to him so he can keep working on changing my heart. I'll come to church every week. Well, every week the pastor had gotten up in front of his congregation and invited the people to come to prayer meeting to talk to God. But nobody came. They were all too busy to spend time with God. Well, on the way home, I'm sure the pastor walked little Bobby home, but when the pastor and Bobby had gotten home, Grandma was so pleased to hear that there had been two, and that Bobby was sure that God had been there. Well, Mr. Curly, that week, he had gone to all the people in that village where they lived, and he had told them about the prayer meeting and how it had been just little Bobby and the minister, and how he had come up to pray too because he wanted to be changed and to be a better person. Well, all the people in the village, they looked down and they were ashamed. And ever after that, there was a steady stream of people going into the church on the weekends and going into the church on Wednesday night, each of them being at least number two. Then the church was full of people there. And like Bobby said, I didn't want God to be disappointed because nobody cared to go speak to him. Boys and girls, you can talk to God anywhere you are, and he will listen. He's listening for you. And I'm sure he's sad when we don't go to church, when we don't go to prayer meetings, when we don't go to a place where we can specifically make the effort to meet with him. Do you know that God loves you so much? Imagine if you had a friend, but you never talked to him. Well, God is your best friend. Please start talking to him, even if it's just you and God. That makes two. Thank you, boys and girls. I'm hoping my voice will be better again by next week. I'll talk to you next week with another story. Bye-bye now.